Hey everyone, Benoy here, and I wanted to share a few quick updates with the Solar Maverick community before we get into today's episode. First, we're hosting a summer solstice fundraiser on June 4th in Jersey City, New Jersey to support Let's Share the Sun, an incredible nonprofit bringing solar to underserved communities in Puerto Rico. This will actually be my third delegation in the past year, and one of the most impactful parts of the experience is meeting the beneficiaries and hearing firsthand how solar is transforming their lives. It's going to be a great evening with strong networking and a chance to support a real meaningful mission. If you're interested in sponsoring, feel free to message me. On April 28th, I will be at the Mid-Atlantic Solar and Storage Industry Association MCA Insight Conference in New Brunswick, New Jersey. I'll also be doing a live Solar Maverick podcast interview with some of the greatest minds in AI, talking about how AI is going to impact the renewable energy industry. So definitely come check that out. And on May 14th, I'll be speaking at the American Council of Renewable Energy Finance Forum in New York City on a panel focused on scaling behind-the-meter solar and storage for commercial, industrial, and digital infrastructure. This is a critical topic as energy demand continues to grow, especially with AI and data centers. Also, make sure to check out the Solar Mavericks podcast new website at www.solarmaverickpodcast.com, where you can find all of our latest episodes and insight from leaders across the energy industry. Now let's get into it. Hi, this is Benoy Thanjan, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast, and also the founder and CEO of Reneu Energy. Reneu Energy, we're a solar developer and consulting firm. We've developed more than 100 megawatts of solar projects across the U.S., and we help clients execute clean energy projects with confidence. We act as your owner's rep, overseeing developers, EPCs, and financing partners to de-risk your project and keep it on schedule. We also provide development as a service, supporting origination strategy and execution so you can advance projects without building a large internal team. On the renewable energy credit side, we offer REC brokerage, REC asset management, and custom renewable energy credit research, helping clients understand pricing, policy shifts, and long-term market dynamics. In addition, we provide new market analysis and financial modeling to evaluate opportunities, assess project viability, and support investment decisions. To learn more, reach out at info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. We'll also have information on the notes of the podcast as well. Let's get into it.
It's not necessarily that everybody's like, oh my God, clean tech is like doomed and it's all doom and gloom. I think there's a definite precedence of we're getting back on the right track of what's meaningful and what's deployable and what's actually going to make a difference short term while we figure out the harder questions about the long term.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick Podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it.
Hi, this is Benoy, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast. I'm really excited in this episode of the Solar Maverick Podcast to have Zainab Gilani. She's the Energy and Power Associate in the Cleantech Group, and Diana Rasner. She's the Group Lead for Materials and Chemicals and Waste and Recycling. They're from the Cleantech Group. The Cleantech Group had an amazing event. I can't believe it was back in January. It feels like so long ago, which it was only like 3 or 4 weeks ago. They had the Cleantech Forum in North America on January 26th to January 28th in San Diego. I had the opportunity to attend the event. I learned a lot from it, and I appreciate the Cleantech Group for having me attend the conference. By the way, it would be great, Zainab and Diana, if you could talk about, the Cleantech Forum, what the Cleantech Group does. Obviously, I talked about your formal titles. If you could go into your backgrounds and what you focus on at the Cleantech Group. And thank you for coming to the Solar Maverick Podcast, making time, especially late on a Friday. I appreciate Addison really wanting both of you to be on the podcast and making it happen. And thank you again for making the time today.
I mean, yeah, thank you so much for having us on, Zainab. Do you want to introduce yourself first, and then we can wrap with what we actually do, what are our day jobs?
Yeah. So I think Diana and I had different experiences at the forum because this is actually my fifth clean tech forum in North America. And this is Diana's actually first in California. So, as you were at the event, you probably saw there were multiple different sessions and they covered like a really wide range of topics. So I work in the energy and power sector. So that covers a really, really broad range of subjects within, the power space, everything from grid technologies, fusion, fission. We had a specific focus on nuclear this time around, also battery storage, and just kinds of like a range of power electronics, all trying to, support getting electricity and renewables on the grid and to support different sectors. So it's been really exciting to see how that kind of sector has been growing over time. So this time around, I think, it's just like it was hard to not have a conversation centered around AI and data centers, and I'm sure we'll get into that later. But there definitely was a lot more excitement, just given the fact that there are quite a lot of opportunities for some of the startups that we're seeing in this space. So yeah, it's like really nice that I'm able to talk to a lot of the different innovators throughout the year, learn a little bit about what they're working on, and also investors, and to see them all come together at the forum.
No, it was a great collection of like obviously startups and then like investors and all the major investors in clean tech. And I appreciate you creating that because I don't think you have like so many people in the room at one time, and it makes collaboration working together easier. Diana, it would be great to hear about your background. And
Love that you came to the forum. It's always the event side of our team is so great about creating these curated panels, discussions where you get the best people in the room to have really meaningful, but also really needed conversations happening in this space, right? And that covers everything. Cleantech Group itself, we've been around since 2002. We actually have the trademark on the term clean tech itself. So if you ever
wow.
hear anybody who's like using that, and maybe they need to pay some royalties somewhere. But honestly, what we really pride ourselves on is we're the human intelligence authority on global clean tech innovation. And that means a lot of different things. But at the soul of it, we've helped decision makers across multiple industries, finance, policy, kind of figure out how to navigate and support a lot of the shifts you're seeing in the global economy with clean tech, with technology evolving. But at the heart of it, we really do some structured market analysis by talking to people, right? Leveraging those relationships, going to these forums, hosting them, and really getting to know the ins, the outs of where things stand. And for us, clean tech is kind of this broad sense of covering everything from thinking like ag and food to my area of like materials, chemicals, waste and recycling. We talk energy and power with Zainab, even like transportation, logistics, and just resource management, right? Lots of plays about resilience popping up, but that's us in a nutshell. And we've continued to do this. And if anybody is out there like, hey, let's have a conversation about this, like, please give us a shout out. And like, we'd love to, that's part of our job is talking to folks.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting because I kind of understand like the research and the unique perspective that you have because having a podcast, I'm talking all over the energy space, solar, renewable as AI. Also, our podcast is about the Solar Maverick podcast about solar and entrepreneurship. I've had my own business now for 13 years. It was great actually like meeting a lot of the startups and the founding team. And there's so much exciting things happening with the energy transition and also talking to investors. I have like close relationships with some of the investors, and I was invited to some offsite investor events and meetings. And so it was great for me because I really learned a lot about like basically the clean tech VC space. And I'm excited to have both of you because obviously I feel like you could educate our Mavericks and I about, what's really happening in the industry. I was also curious too. Obviously, you have the Clean Tech Forum in North America, which was just in San Diego. What are some of the events that are coming up in the near future? We're now at February 20th.
Yeah, so the next event that we actually will be hosting would be Clean Tech Forum Asia. That's happening May 20th and 21st in Singapore. It comes right at the tail end of Ecosperity Week for those who are familiar with kind of ecosystem out there. Think take North America, but put it in a different region. And a lot of the challenges and also opportunities change and shift, right? not everything, as one of our colleagues would say, is focused on the US and America. So the type of innovation and the type of solutions you need out there, like, vary wildly. And then in November, we also have our Cleantech Forum Europe. Location TBD, we are narrowing that down right now. But again, take the same philosophy about clean tech and its ability to have cleaner, more sustainable, more resilient solutions at the table and bring it to the EU. So another whole host of challenges, opportunities, players in that game that kind of bring to light, it's not a one size fits all solution, but everybody's working towards the same thing.
Yeah, definitely. That's really great to understand. I can't wait to find, where the event is in Europe. And I hope I can make the one in Singapore in May. I've spent a lot of time in Asia and Southeast Asia, the solar energy development. Obviously, the Cleantech North America Forum was 3 weeks away, or 3 weeks, or almost 4 weeks ago. I can't believe that. But how would you describe like the overall tone and mood of this year's event, maybe compared to other years?
Zainab, I'll let you start on this one because this is now your
Yeah.
fifth one from what you just
This
said.
I think it's been exciting to see just like, I want to say the overlap of markets and different technologies. So because I cover such a wide sector, whether it's like batteries or nuclear technologies or like power electronics, just seeing some of the connections and partnerships that can occur and like seeing how people are like fitting the puzzle pieces together has been really exciting. So like just to give a couple of examples, like I was talking to a company that was working in the fusion space and their primary customers in the fusion space, but as they're looking at the growth of data centers and also the needs for the grid, just seeing how their technology can fit into some of the problems that are occurring elsewhere, and also just other systems and technologies that maybe didn't have the right customer or market right away. They're trying to figure it out. But like these opportunities with data centers are opening up potentially new customer bases, if not with the data centers themselves, but with some of the partners or some of the other energy providers that are out there. So yeah, it's been exciting to see how all these conversations have been kind of a little bit more interconnected this time around.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's amazing that you cover so many different aspects, right, of the energy space. And, things are changing so quickly. You mentioned in the beginning, Zainab, like AI, data centers, nuclear, modular nuclear,
Yeah.
fusion, fission. Like, I still don't know how you're able to like keep up track. And that's great that you're able to do that because it's extremely challenging in this market. And that's what the value, your company and you provide. It's interesting too, like, I guess what do you see like with clean tech capital and where it's flowing in 2026?
Yeah. And then maybe one thing I want to mention
Sure.
on this point about like maybe how this tone is different from last year. I think what I didn't mention was like last year was 2025. So it was like right on the heels of the inauguration and the Trump election. So there was this feeling of uncertainty as to like what that would actually look like. And now we're in 2026 and we've kind of seen what happened in 2025. So it's a little bit more just like being realistic and practical on how to move forward. And I know, Diana, you've had like a lot of conversations with investors and startups on how they're thinking about like scaling. I'm sure you can add quite a bit.
Yeah, I think so. This is my first exposure to Cleantech Forum North America, right? Previously, any of the conferences and shows that I would go to were like these massive trade ones. Like I was at CERAWeek for a moment, World Hydrogen, all of that. So this was actually a little bit of a refreshing shift from my eyes in not just the scale, but the quality of the conversations, but also looking at how people are deploying and also financing a lot of things. The tone has definitely shifted, and it's one that's a lot more pragmatic. It's less about, oh, what's the next silver bullet that's going to save us all, and very much about what are the solutions that fit right now that I can deploy quickly to gain ground while I scale up, or that aren't as capital intensive as a few of the other folks who are more mature in this space, kind of like navigating that area. And to Zainab's point, like the administration change here in the US had like huge ramifications, especially in actually my area particularly. I'm sure everybody was well aware of like the big hydrogen boom that happened and then the bust that occurred, the IRA kind of getting gutted in terms of incentives. So it's not necessarily that everybody's like, oh my God, clean tech is like doomed and it's all doom and gloom. I think there's a definite precedence of we're getting back on the right track of what's meaningful and what's deployable and what's actually going to make a difference short term while we figure out the harder questions about the long term.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. Obviously, the big beautiful bill took a lot of like the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by the Biden administration. It's interesting too because the big beautiful bill did keep like the energy storage investment tax credit 20, I think it's 33 or 34. I could be messing up the year. And then they kept transferability, which makes it easier for, projects to get tax equity. But then obviously there's been challenges related to changing the investment tax credit specifically for the solar industry. And obviously, offshore wind has had
Mm,
challenges with the new administration. And then, as well, with the Department of Energy, there was a lot of funding for early stage clean energy or energy companies. Actually, the Department of Energy just released like the new sort of prizes, and it's very different from like what it was before. But it's interesting to see what the administration's focusing on. We actually have like better guidance. And then I think it was this morning, the Supreme Court determined that a lot of the tariffs you cannot be doing. So, the energy industry has been impacted by that as well. Things have been extremely expensive. Obviously, I'm focused on solar and I've seen multiple tariffs on panels and obviously steel and other equipment. So it's been like very interesting times, especially, for the clean tech industry. How has it been like from the investor perspective? I had actually a lot of investor meetings, clean tech forum, and it was interesting to get like their perspective of what they're seeing with startups. Some of them, what you mentioned, Zainab, was obviously like they're seeing a lot of things related to AI and data centers, also seeing ways of like optimizing like what the utilities are doing and the new business model with DERs and distributed energy resources. And Diana, as you said, like I think people are being more realistic than maybe in the past, especially now we have a lot more guidance really from the administration because now it's been 13 months. Whereas obviously the Clean Tech Forum 2025 was just the inauguration. So it'd be great to get your perspective on like what are investors like thinking and where is clean tech capital flowing in 2026?
I can start because I feel like a lot of it's going to be centered around energy and power anyway. So I think you raise a really good point about being mindful of kind of like where this administration is focused on and where some of the challenges are. One of the things I do want to mention is that there are some areas where you are seeing bipartisan support. So like particularly in areas of like nuclear and geothermal, although like, these aren't traditionally what you would think of as like the most exciting topics previous or like, years before, nuclear had like quite a lot of challenges, at least from like a marketing perspective, about like trying to scale it as like a clean and renewable technology. But we saw like record numbers of venture capital going into these sectors. A Fervo raised quite a large round, around like 400 million last year. Same thing in the fission sector. We saw like a pretty substantial uptick in the numbers that we were seeing, close to around like between 2 and 2 billion compared to like 1 billion before, especially on the VC side. And then fusion, which has always been considered, a long shot, has been continuously raising funds just because many investors and corporates are excited about the potential progress that fusion holds. And I know the administration has been looking into these technologies as well. But one of the main points that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting is that you kind of have to think about like the policy landscape and how the areas that you're investing in have to kind of be resilient regardless of the administration and what the kinds of changes that are going to occur. So there are a lot of opportunities also like to support AI and data centers, not only on the power generation side, but kind of like on the picks and shovels and the enabling technologies, the power electronics, the power control units, technologies relating to siting, software optimization, liquid cooling. There's all these different kinds of solutions and innovations that I think we'll potentially be seeing a lot more investment and traction in the future, but also being mindful of like how these companies continue to scale with like the right partners will also be pretty important. And I know, Diana, you've had quite a number of conversations also just like on scaling and just like how you've also been seeing particular areas gain traction.
For me, it's the whole idea that AI is proliferating into everything is absolutely true, right? It's now, I can't tell you how many startups and companies at this point, just within the last year that I've been with Cleantech Group, like have somehow enabled putting AI into their platform somewhere, right? And it's very much not a case of, at this point, it's a you must. It's no longer a option. And the has different aspects to it. It's now like this is what is required for you to be even in the conversation Whereas before it was like a way to potentially put you ahead. From my side, a lot of that finance and the investor sentiment is definitely following this trend. Like there's a big consensus that AI is the future of what a lot of our industry groups are going to be going after, and for good reason. It's a lot more efficient. You get to do a lot more with the data that normally a human would have to sit behind. You can make decisions quicker. Like there's a lot of good things coming out of it. The perspective that I bring from the materials and chemical side is there's still a very obvious physical footprint that has to come from that, right? So like when you build these data centers, where you get not just the chips, but the infrastructure, the cement, the steel, everything that actually is used to develop and build those rooms and those racks, you know, this is kind of one of those areas for me that the people who are in this space, who are building this up, have a really big responsibility to do it sustainably. And it's kind of a matter of you clearly have the money, you have the resources, now do the right thing. And with that, a lot of the clean tech innovation is going towards that way. So I'm really excited to see how this kind of evolves as these are getting built, who they're partnering with to ensure, they are very acutely aware of the impact they're going to have. How do they mitigate that to the best of their ability when it comes to water usage, when it comes to energy usage, right? When it comes to the sheer volume of materials needed that has to switch hands, whether it be domestically sourced or imported somewhere. And that's a whole other topic of things that I'm sure you're very familiar with in that space.
Yeah, that is so interesting. You mentioned these are great points, Diana. Like, obviously, we've been hearing that, the thirst for energy of the hyperscalers, especially in the US, we're not ready to deal with it. Obviously, like, projects are getting stuck on the data center side and like energy resources. We're also seeing like the big tech companies, saying that they're going to develop their own energy projects. I forget, I think it was Amazon or it could be Meta who was going to develop their own nuclear project. It's interesting because you mentioned nuclear geothermal. Obviously that takes a longer time to actually get that energy to come online. But it's interesting because like solar and storage is still like the cheapest form of energy that could quickly come online. But for the energy transition of the future, need a lot of different technologies, microgrids, where you could incorporate different technologies. And to me, it's like amazing to see like how many startups are in the space because you were mentioning it, Diana, like there's so many unique startups like focusing on different things, from the materials perspective, from like data centers. I met a startup, your event, that was doing data cooling, obviously AI and energy. What are like investor perspectives and what are they funding? Because I also heard like becoming a lot more selective on the opportunities that they're investing in from the forum. And then also the challenging thing is like things are taking more capital or cash or more investment. So it's getting hard for them. And then also too, it's taking longer to get to a monetization or an exit. Is that like what have you been hearing from like the venture capital clean tech VC companies out there from your conversations or from the forum?
I'll start with my side, Zainab, and then you can add in from yours. I think we're seeing this interesting evolution of VCs in clean tech, right? I almost want to say if you are in clean tech and you're in a VC fund, you almost need to just understand this is patient capital at this point. This is not Silicon Valley. This is not, software. There are software applications out there, but most of this is embedded in deep tech. And that takes time, that takes resources, that takes a lot of, hard work behind that. That is not just about getting your first, iteration or your first pilot. It's then doing it over and over again, and not just doing that, but scaling it and using capital efficiently too. So as far as like the VC side, depending on where a company is, you're either seeing a lot of folks identify and jump on opportunities that they seek or can withstand whatever might be happening policy or regulation wise, right? And ones that are addressing acute problems right now. So even in the AI and data center world, what I love about what Zainab covers in her side is a lot of these grid resiliency and instabilities that affect everybody. These are technologies that will continue to be used regardless of how you want to think about the AI bubble. Like if you have a power outage, if you have a blackout, if you have, areas of high power demand that must stay on 24/7, these are enabling technologies that allow you to do that. And those will always be needed no matter where you are in the world. And in that case, like VCs are also getting a lot more selective and smarter because they have so much history now, previous companies entering here, right? It's like you have all of this data available to you of previous companies and things that have already been done. It's like, how is somebody setting themselves apart that much further, or that's offering something that's much better, which isn't already there? And in that case, less rounds, but bigger ones is what I'm seeing.
I was just saying that was a great point.
I was just going to say that, like, adding on to Diana's point, like some of the conversations I've had with investors also kind of range on like what their focus is and like what kind of investor that they are. So like the breakthrough energies and ventures, they have like their own kind of mandate and thesis and how they're thinking about their investment strategy, but also like how they're potentially also going to be thinking and focusing more about like scaling and deploying as opposed to looking at some of these newer investment strategies. And also just like maybe, conversations I've had with investors who like maybe their first funds didn't do as well. Like, is it harder to raise their second fund? And like, what's their strategy going to be for their second fund? What's their risk profile going to look like when they're looking at these companies? And it sounds like for some, investors are not able to take as much risk as they previously were. And so they may be focusing more exclusively on like software organizations and tools where it'll be a little bit easier to do due diligence and see the potential trajectory to scale.
That's really great perspective. And great thing about the forum, it curates discussions, right, between investors and obviously early stage founders or early stage clean tech companies. Can you talk about like what qualities of an early stage startup make it attractive to like investors, and maybe even what if there's certain, it sounds like there could be certain sectors within clean tech that are more popular than others based on what you're telling me?
Okay. So for me, what I really love when I talk to a new startup in the space is they have a very clear idea of what problem they are solving that exists now, right? And how they're going to get there, but also that they are willing to admit and understand any of the challenges and sensitivities that might affect their ability to scale or to deploy. So a lot of this is in your first rounds that I've seen, like let's talk seed, pre-seed, whatever that might be. You've got this brilliant idea. No one's ever seen it, or it's really unique. You think this has the potential to change the world, right? Now you're talking TAM. Now you're talking, I can hit these billions, if not trillions of dollars of potential. And that's how you get your first round. It's that next step and the next subsequent steps where I'm going to be asking the questions of, well, who's your competitors, right? And I'm not talking about your competitors that are startups. I'm talking about who are your corporates and your incumbents who already have solutions out there. Hopefully you get bought by, or that you provide a service for, or like an application for. And how are you actually going to get to the scale and get to the relevancy that they care about? So then it's like, now we're talking unit economics. Now we're talking about the cost to actually deploy things. So my favorites, the ones that really stand out for me, are the ones that are already thinking about that when they're already very small. And they're able to be flexible as the world turns, as things go crazy, as administration changes and all of that good stuff. They're resilient from the beginning and able to flex and adapt as needed out the get-go.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. There's so many great points from it. It's interesting because you mentioned corporates, goes perfectly into our next question is like, are corporates playing like a larger role in funding and scaling clean energy innovation today?
Damn, maybe you should talk to the energy fact. I would say the answer is absolutely yes, right?
Of
Yeah.
course.
I think there's a lot of ways that like corporates are involved, both as an investor, strategic partner, and then potential customer or even potential pathway for an exit or acquisition. So the way that corporates can be involved can be as an investor. So maybe coming in their seed round, seeing how that technology scales and grows, potentially supporting the startup develop, their first pilots, and then moving on from there with like a larger kind of channel partnership. But I think maybe some of the tricky things is like, even though some of these startups do have these initial conversations and partnerships and press releases with these corporates, like to what degree can those continue to scale both with that corporate, but with other corporate entities as well? And how can they also scale their technology to capture a wider section of the market? So that's like one area of how like corporates can be involved. I think one example that I saw that's really interesting is how corporates have been involved in scaling liquid cooling. So we've seen a number of exits in this space of liquid cooling. I think the more recent one has been Train Technologies' acquisition of Liquid Stack. There's been a couple others in the space with Boyd Thermal and Childyne last year. And in the case of Liquid Stack, or in the case of like a few of the other organizations, there were at least investors coming in these initial rounds and then acquiring these technologies. So I think that type of example is really interesting to see how that moves forward too.
Yeah, definitely. That's really great perspective. I appreciate you sharing. And then it's interesting because you actually talked about like there's different sorts of partnerships that are gaining traction. You obviously mentioned with corporates and startups. Is there anything different that you're seeing than what you just mentioned that's gaining traction?
I think maybe with the utility space, it's a little bit tricky because it's hard to kind of say like in some cases that like, oh, this company has this partnership with the utility. What does that look like for like that pilot or for like that one project versus like, oh, this company also has a partnership with the utilities, but they're working with like 200 different utilities. So like they've had that kind of relationship built out and they've had that de-risking. So it just makes it easier and easier for them to move that relationship forward. I think that's where some of the corporate customer scale up is a little bit different between who the partner is and who the corporate is.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. I mean, we're seeing like really a lot of startups creating innovation to help the utilities, especially in the new sort of business model going forward. And it's interesting because I've spoken to several startups and obviously the complexity, and it takes time too for the utilities or energy companies to incorporate or take on their technology. And that's some of the feedback that I've gotten. But obviously, once you're able to work with a lot of different utilities, and I was hearing have their own requirements,
Yeah.
which make it unique and complicated. But obviously, once they're a customer, even though it might take a long time, it's obviously, really beneficial because they obviously have, each of them have huge customer bases that these products could take advantage of for sure. Are you seeing more of that or as well?
I want to see more of it. I think to your point, I've heard from different startups that like the procurement process is challenging. So like not only just like working with the utility and kind of dealing with those long sales cycles, but it's like who's the right contact? Like are you working with all the people that you need to work with at all the different departments and have you had all those kind of verifications and certifications met and is everyone on the same page? Because I think one of the interesting things I've heard is that like maybe one company was working with like an innovation team at a utility and they thought they would scale with the rest of the utility, but then it turned out that that was mostly just like a smaller project and it didn't have the opportunity that they wanted to have versus like maybe they were working with another utility and they were talking to all the right people. So I think navigating those different relationships is really important and also potentially underestimated.
Oh, for sure. And it's all relationship based. And obviously, I think, the utilities are obviously large firms and there's a lot of maybe different divisions and they have to be obviously communicating with each other. And it's obviously challenging for a startup to really, get in and the whole
Yeah.
process that it takes to actually, how they actually build this relationship, whether it be through an RFP process or through some sort of direct relationship. I've been hearing a lot. And also too, like it's been challenging for the utilities because obviously they have a tried and true model. You're asking them to basically disrupt themselves in this whole process, which at the end of the day, it's going to happen, but it could take longer because you have established companies and investor-owned utilities, that are focused on shareholder value and not necessarily the energy transition as the primary focus, which I've been hearing from a lot of startups. I'm trying to say it in a nice euphemistic way.
No, it's actually a great. This is a prime case of Cleantech's definition throughout its like growth has always changed, right? And I think right now in this day and age, we're at a point where obviously if you're a corporate or if you're an incumbent in this space, It's not to say you don't care about sustainability, that you don't care about cleaner technologies, but the first thing on your mind when somebody comes to you with an idea saying we can be better is how much is this going to cost me and what is this going to disrupt me, right?
Yeah.
So this kind of notion about disruptive technologies, I always have to say, how much are you disrupting if you should be at all? Because you have to
Yes.
think like, what is it going to mean in terms of reliability? What is it going to mean in terms of my overall dollar value? Like, do I have to change my core fundamental process that I already know how to run 24/7 with this much uptime to use you to maybe save 1%, 2%, whatever it might be, right? Whatever you're adding to that value. And in this case, like right now, my answer is you get that plus you get to be cleaner, right? Like
Yes.
if we think to the journey that any of these startups are on, it takes that risk taking to get to a point where you're now the standard. It takes somebody putting themselves in a situation, a secure situation, right? As far as piloting or actually deploying, for you to be able to get that data to say, yeah, I can offer you this and be cleaner, more like save you water, save you power, energy efficiency, whatever that might be. It's a bit of a, I don't want people to be like, well, the first thing that comes out of your mind is, well, how much does it cost me? It's the truth. You have to think about that first if you really want to go after the big guys. But at the same time, you also need to realize that their priorities shift all the time, right? And the
Yes.
one priority that's never going to shift is the shareholder priority.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's a good point. The other thing too, what's interesting because there were VCs there and they represent like energy companies, and obviously it's a great way of, having an investor who could be a strategic partner and give you business. The other thing I was hearing from the energy companies were they're under a lot of pressure on power pricing and pricing to to customers because historically, obviously, energy pricing has been relatively flat, but now we're seeing energy prices go up. So they're trying to come up with obviously creative ways. They've been pressured, by different parties, obviously the ratepayers, but then also government entities. There's been like the election in New Jersey where, electricity prices became a front and center issue. Also, there's a whole thing about resiliency and reliability with the grid, and obviously grid infrastructure costs a lot to replace. So they're trying to come up with creative solutions with distributed energy resources and microgrids. Is that like a theme that you're seeing, or is that something that's not really a focus?
Microgrids and virtual power plants have been a huge topic of conversation, at least just given the fact that like when you're seeing these trends with load growth, you have to think about how can you manage it. And if you're able to tap into resources that are already there, you just have to be connected. That provides an immense opportunity. But it's just like, how do you do that in a smart way where it's like, yes, you have software in this cloud infrastructure and you have these disaggregated resources, but what is the best way to optimize each system and to have them connected and to have a solution that also stabilizes the grid? So I don't know if you were if you were able to talk to a company, their grid care, they do AI-based solutions to support both utilities and data centers, mostly just to help find additional capacity on the grid that to support new projects or just to support projects in general. And then there's this other organization based in San Diego. They're community aggregators. So they work behind the meter and they work with the customers on how they can best manage their energy solutions and how that relates to the grid and potentially reducing their cost for electricity. So I think as we think about this from bringing new projects online, which is going to be important for corporates, they're going to have to think about this. For energy users who are looking to reduce their energy costs, they're going to need to think about this. And then also just from a resiliency perspective, if you have all these new systems, what are potential ways to make sure that these power generating units, the energy storage units, the grid infrastructure, they can stay online if anything happens to one section or another, whether that's due to a climate risk, weather related event, or any other sort of disaster? How do you keep all these systems online? And so that interconnected part of the conversation is going to be really important as we think about load growth, but also resiliency.
Yeah, those are all great points. And I was in a session at the Cleantech Forum in North America where someone will actually spend a lot of time talking about cyber security. And, obviously, there are foreign actors who are trying to take down the US grid and how like startups related to improving, obviously, the security of the grid, and obviously having distributed resources as well will help with reliability. I don't know if you're seeing that as well, where there's startups that are focused on obviously DERs, but then also making sure that the grid's not taken down.
I'll say from my side, like there is this huge influence and influx of developers who are bringing the plants to themselves, right? So they're not waiting for
That's
the grid
true.
to connect. They're not the day and age of saying that I can go and get a PPA for this amount of money from the utilities. Like, yes, it still exists, but those are going to be very short term with the amount of power we're projecting needed for a lot of this development, right? So maybe at one point you could get a 10-year, 25-year PPA with the grid. Now, who knows? Maybe it's 5, maybe it's 3. And when you go to finance those types of projects, especially if you're relying on power for anything you're doing, God forbid it is like an electrified process in my area, like with materials and chemicals, like that is a OpEx driver that you have to consider is not going to be the same today, if not 10 days from now, if not like 10 years from now. So that type of like being able to have a resilient power play, right, with
For
your
sure.
own that you can control yourself is huge. But also in the terms of this like distributed model of things, that's just a clear case of when we look at how centralized a lot of things happen. The EU is a perfect example of this in the energy and power space, right? I think there may be only a handful of refineries left in the EU for fuel. One of the things that people always look at in terms of, national security and defense is if I had to go and fuel a fleet somewhere, where am I getting that fuel from? From a refinery. That's a pretty obvious target of something I can shut down. Or in the case of what we're seeing, like with the Russia Ukraine, let's just turn up a pipeline, right? So a lot of great use cases of this kind of resiliency, not just in the form of, production of things, but also in the terms of just like being able to have your everyday life not get disrupted. I mean, Spain had huge power blackouts this last summer. The storms are getting more and more severe. I was a victim of the lovely winter Uri in Texas, where thankfully I didn't lose power but lost water. That's just becoming more common now. And with that, I've had a great conversation with somebody in New York where he was like, we understand that infrastructure needs to be updated. We know that it costs a lot of money, but it's not sexy and it's not investable, but it has to be done. So in comes this kind of wave of clean tech innovation to help kind of bridge that gap until somebody hopefully wakes up and says, this is something we need to fix. Then the question is who pays for it, right?
Well, that's the big question. And then obviously, like everyone wants to do a band-aid solution when it comes to the energy infrastructure of the US, and it's too important to not. And a lot of obviously the infrastructure, not just on the energy side, is extremely aging, and we haven't really, unfortunately, done anything. And it's really interesting, Diana, the whole point about disruption related to energy. And obviously, Europe's trying to figure out how to diversify out of Russian oil. And they're kind of in a rock and a hard place because they transit, as you mentioned, the whole refinery thing. And it's interesting because the same thing's happening in the US with the hyperscalers. And then you have the issue where the residential customers probably paying more for their electricity because of energy usage by a lot bigger party that has a lot more money. And then unfortunately, they're paying for that. So that's really like interesting, like perspective. And I feel like we could keep talking on and on about there's so many things that are happening in the space and clean energy and clean tech. There was actually something I was going to mention, but I feel like it's going to lead to another, a longer discussion that we probably could do at another time. What excites you about the direction of clean energy transition right now? We're still really only in the beginning of it, even though it seems for us in the industry who've been here a while that there's been so much innovation. But I think like there's going to be, I mean, the exponential innovation's going to increase, especially with AI, and we're already seeing that. Can you talk about like what you both are excited about in your respective categories that you cover?
Re-emphasize the point that you mentioned where it's like when you have this like pressure effect. There's like the saying, necessity is like the mother of invention. So you're going to see, all these startups that maybe were a little bit more risky, seeing more potential pathways to scale if there is that pressure that's out there. And so like, at least when it comes to AI, I think if we were seeing potentially these data centers being propped up on a longer timeline, which would like allow for more renewables to be added onto the grid in a more kind of sustainable manner, I'd be really excited about all those technologies that could be scaled up to support that fully kind of like electrified future and solution where we do have, the majority of our energy and resources coming from renewables. But that being said, just like seeing all these different solutions that kind of like follow along that value chain, supporting AI and data centers, whether that's different types of batteries, units and power orchestration and transformers. Like just this week, we saw DG Matrix and Heron Power raise 80 million or like 60 million and 140 million in their recent investments round. So seeing these types of technologies that are going to scale to both support AI and data centers, but also the grid itself are going to be pretty critical. And then also just like these other solutions when it comes to different types of power generation, previously, fusion was always considered far away, and maybe it still is. But if you're having pressure from AI and data centers, and they're also investing in these types of technologies, I think those will be really interesting to look forward to as well. And then Diana, I know like at least for you, you're thinking about like construction and also just like the different materials that are gonna happen in the future.
I'm really excited by, like, as you said, like, necessity is the mother of invention. Is a lot of people are rethinking materials from the ground up at this point. AI is definitely helping facilitate that. I have opinions about that kind of AI enabled platforms that's a little bit contrary to how other folks might feel about this. But at the same time, some great push on how do you take a material that already exists and make it that much more efficient, that much more, friendly for use in other use cases. What can I add to this that already exists to get more resilient, to wind, to fire, to whatever the situations might be. And that can be in the form of, adding coatings to power lines to help with like heat issues. This could be in the form of people rethinking like the transmission lines from copper and using things like graphite or graphene, right? It's really looking towards solutions that you can replace immediately and not have a like trickle down effect of like where your performance was lost. Like the technologies are there, they're mature, they're ready to go. It's just actually using them and getting them into deployable, repeatable pilots and demonstrations. That's really a big bottleneck that's happening in my space. And then like talking about the hyperscaler side, like again, I tell you, you have the resources, you have the money, you have the potential to do something really good here. So just do it. I can't see an excuse to why you wouldn't want to make this as sustainable as possible, especially when you look at the current climate, right? We don't have enough water. We're looking at, desalinating and transporting and trucking, which is its own huge issue. You're building these areas that are already drought prone, let alone like having heating dome effects. These are going to be technologies that here in the US, we're really good about getting them out the ground. I think the future for me is really exciting is to see where these go the next 10 years, the next 20 years as they kind of evolve across globally, right? How do you make the city of the future be that much more sustainable, that much more resilient in the wake of what's happening while we try to fix the mess that we've already created?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Like necessity is the mother of invention. I think there are things that we don't even know about that will probably help with the clean energy transition. And, obviously there's a lot of pressure and a lot of solutions that need to be solved. And there's a lot of smart people who are working on it. I'm amazed every day with the innovation that people are coming up with in the clean tech space. And I appreciate, obviously, you both are at the forefront of it and you're talking to these companies and you're obviously creating a community through it and obviously your research as well and obviously having events like you did the great event that you had just in San Diego. If our audience wants to learn more about the Cleantech Group or the events that they have or specifically about the work that you're doing, Diana and Zainab, what's the best way that they could do that?
Well, I'll say if you haven't already followed us with our newsletter, go sign up there. Go to cleantech.com. You'll learn more about what we do as a whole. That includes events, that includes advocacy, consulting, and of course, our lovely market intelligence and research that Zainab, I, and the rest of our team puts together. frequently release blogs about our opinions and what we are actually seeing in this space. So if you have something you want to share, if you have a perspective, if you are working in this space, whether it be energy and power or any of the other sectors like materials and chemicals, ag and food, like it really is a matter of it takes a village to make change, right? And the more relationships you can build, the more you can get people talking and get them in front of each other. That's really what we're here for. Also say, follow us on LinkedIn. Shout out to Addison for getting us in touch. If you love any of the stuff you were talking about, like just reach out. Happy to always have a conversation with anybody and whoever that might be. Like hopefully it continues. We just keep looking and moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. This was an amazing interview. I appreciate both of your leadership in the clean energy, clean tech space. Keep up the great work. I feel like we could have talked for another 2 to 3 hours. This has been an amazing interview. We'll have everything to reach out to you in the notes of the podcast. And thank you again. You both provided really great insight. And if people haven't attended, definitely look at the Clean Tech Forum. Obviously, their final, it's coming up in Singapore in May, I think. And then obviously you're finalizing the date in Europe and obviously the great research that you're doing as well. And thank you again for your time today.
Thanks, Benoy.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Reneu Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.